What would you do if the love of your life was hiding a secret so devastating that it would destroy every pillar of your existence, every memory, every whispered promise? I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment what city you are watching from, because the story I am about to tell will challenge everything you think about trust and love. He was Daniel. She was Clara. Together, they were the personification of perfection. Their lives, a shimmering mosaic of exchanged smiles, whispered plans, and a future drawn with the purest of paints, seemed untouchable. But behind Clara's bright eyes, a subtle shadow began to form. A cold premonition, an icy chill that defied the logic of that seemingly unshakable love. It was a whisper, almost imperceptible, that something fundamental was about to collapse. The stage was set for the awakening of a truth no one would ever suspect. The routine of Daniel and Clara, once a synchronized choreography of affection and laughter, began to fall out of tune. It wasn't an earthquake, but a subtle tremor, a minuscule deviation in the score of life that Clara, with her sharp sensitivity, was the first to feel. Daniel, the man she knew better than herself, whose habits were as predictable as the sunrise, began to show blank pages in his daily log. Small absences, at first, easily justified and quickly forgotten. A business lunch that stretched past the usual time, a last-minute call from the office that kept him late into the night. "Stress, my love, it's the pressure," he would say, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach the depth of his previously transparent eyes. Clara, enveloped in the bubble of their love, accepted it, attributing the increasing fatigue on his face and the tip of veiled irritation in her voice to the burden of the corporate world. But the seed of doubt, however minuscule, had been planted. She felt the shift, a dissonant vibration in what was once a perfect melody. It was like a shadow stretching out at dusk, too subtle to be immediately noticed, but present. Daniel's gaze, once so firm and full of adoration when fixed on her, now lost itself in the void, as if his mind were elsewhere, in a parallel universe inaccessible to her. During dinner, where before their hands would meet under the table in a familiar dance, Daniel's hand now rested inert beside his plate, his thumb drumming a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. When she asked, her voice colored with growing apprehension, "Is everything okay, Danny?" "You seem distant," he responded with an "I'm fine, just thinking," and a hurried kiss on the forehead, more a perfunctory seal than an expression of affection. The coldness was not an impenetrable wall, but a fog that slowly settled, transforming familiar warmth into something lukewarm, almost indifferent. Mornings, once full of lazy caresses and whispered plans, were now marked by a solitary awakening for Clara. Daniel was already up, or he would rise with unusual haste, murmuring about tight deadlines and the need to arrive early. The smell of coffee, once an invitation to intimacy, now seemed a reminder of his absence. She watched him from the bedroom doorway, her heart tight, as he dressed in an unusual silence, his silhouette tense against the faint light of dawn. Clara desperately tried to ignore what her intuition was screaming. Her mind, a bulwark of optimism and unshakable faith in that love, constructed complex narratives to justify every deviation. "He's under too much pressure. It's a tough phase at work. All couples go through this." She clung to these phrases like a life raft in a sea that, without her realizing it, was starting to churn. The voice of reason, her shield against the uncomfortable truth, prevented her from seeing the crack, still minuscule, opening in the foundation of her world. It was a crack that didn't manifest in fights or arguments, but in the absence of them, in the lack of a connection that was once as natural as breathing. Daniel's cell phone, once an open communication tool between them, had become an object of mystery. Flipped face down on the table, taken to the bathroom, consulted with a frequency that Clara found strange, his face lit up by the screen and an expression she couldn't decipher. One night, she woke up and found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her, the cell phone in hand, scrolling the screen with an air of deep concentration. When he felt her gaze, he started, quickly putting the device away and lying down, turning over with a "can't sleep, love." The lie, however subtle, seemed to vibrate in the dense air of the room. That pang in Clara's chest, which was once a fleeting sensation, now became a constant weight. A cold premonition, a foreboding that defied logic, but which settled in her gut. What was once mere intuition, a shiver down her spine, now manifested in sleepless nights, in a lump in her throat that prevented words from coming out, in a growing emptiness where there was once fullness. She found herself watching Daniel, searching for the man she loved in his gestures, in his smiles, in his eyes, but found only a distorted reflection, a distant echo of who he used to be. The voice of reason, which had protected her so much from confronting the painful reality, began to fail. The argument she built for herself became fragile, unable to contain the rising tide of truth. The crack, once an almost imperceptible line, now seemed to widen, emitting a silent, yet persistent sound of something giving way. The stage was set, not for the continuation of a perfect romance, but for the slow and inexorable collapse of an illusion. Clara felt, with a dull and growing ache, that what was unraveling was not just the routine, but the essence of who they were. And the awakening of that truth, she knew, would be more devastating than any nightmare. The afternoon stretched lazily over Clara's apartment, tinting the walls with a pale gold that she once loved. Today, it seemed just another layer of dust on the perfection that, she realized, was beginning to blur. She was looking for a pen, an object so trivial it should barely matter, but which would become the conductor for the first knot in her throat. Daniel's favorite pen was missing, and she thought to check the pockets of the jacket he had left draped over the armchair in the living room. It was a habit of his, always forgetting something in his pockets. She picked up the jacket, a heavy dark wool blouson, and the familiar texture brushed against her fingers. She plunged her hand into the side pocket, expecting to feel the tip of the pen, but her fingers touched something cold, hard, and unexpected. She pulled her hand out, and there, in her palm, lay a small piece of jewelry. It wasn't a ring, nor an earring, but a delicate pendant, a small silver heart studded with an opaque stone, a blue she had never seen before. Her eyes fixed on it. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it wasn't hers. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine, an icy tremor that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Her mind, trained for logic, tried desperately to construct explanations. Maybe it was a gift Daniel had bought for her, a surprise. But he was never one to hide gifts so carelessly. And if it was, why hadn't he mentioned it? That very thought, that he might be hiding something, however innocent, was a crack in itself. She turned the pendant between her fingers, the cold silver against her skin, and an image of Daniel's routine, once so transparent, now emerged with shadows, corners she couldn't illuminate. The silver heart, once harmless, now seemed to pulse with a silent, unsettling question. She hid the jewelry at the back of a drawer, as if by putting it out of sight, she could put it out of mind. But its weight, even invisible, remained. The days that followed were marked by a new vigilance, subtle and almost unconscious, like an internal radar she couldn't switch off. Her eyes, once full of confident love, now filtered the world through a veil of uncertainty. The jewelry was a whisper, but what came next was a scream, albeit a silent one. One evening, Daniel was in the shower, the sound of the water muffling the rest of the apartment. Clara was in the kitchen, preparing tea, when his cell phone, forgotten on the counter, vibrated. Once, twice, 3 times. She ignored the first, as she always had, respecting his space and privacy. But the third vibration was accompanied by a persistent light on the screen, and a name flashed, briefly, before the screen went dark again. It was not a familiar name. It wasn't the name of any colleague she knew, nor a friend. It was a strange, feminine name she had never heard Daniel mention. Clara's heart raced, a savage drum beating against her ribs. The teapot slipped slightly in her damp hand, and she set it back on the counter with a dull thud. Her mind spun in circles, trying to cling to any logical explanation. Wrong number, telemarketing, an old contact. But the intensity of those 3 vibrations, the way the name seemed to scream from the screen, all added up to the image of the small silver heart hidden in the drawer. She felt the air thin out, as if all the certainty surrounding her was being sucked into a vacuum. Her eyes welled up, not with immediate sadness, but with a deep, icy realization. The perfection they had built, the bubble of security and trust they lived in, now seemed to have an invisible flaw. It was a minuscule crack, yes, but Clara felt that once seen, it could never be ignored again. She knew, with a painful certainty that made her tremble, that something was fundamentally wrong. The whisper of doubt had turned into a persistent ringing in her ears, and she knew there would be no peace until the truth, whatever it was, came to light. The perfect melody of their lives had, indeed, found a dissonant note, and the sound was deafening in its silence. The dissonant note, the one that had pierced the silence of their perfect lives, didn't disappear with time. It echoed, a persistent ringing in Clara's mind, distorting every melody, every laugh, every silence. The small forgotten jewelry, the unknown name flashing on Daniel's cell phone screen, these were splinters lodged deep, painfully. Clara tried, with the delicacy of someone walking on eggshells, to approach Daniel. At first, they were casual questions, disguised as innocent curiosity. "Did you find the pen?" Love? Speaking of which, what was that little stone I saw in your jacket? I forgot to ask. Daniel replied with a hurried smile, his eyes subtly shifting away. Oh, the pen. Not yet. The little stone. Must be something I picked up at the office, a piece of broken decoration. I don't know. I didn't even notice. The forced naturalness in his voice, the quick gesture to dismiss the conversation, were like a knot tightening in Clara's stomach. He kissed her on the forehead, a kiss shorter than usual, and changed the subject to dinner, as if the question had never been raised. The air around them, once so light, now felt thin, heavy with what was unspoken. The days followed, and Clara's restlessness grew, transforming into a shadow that followed her through every room in the house. She tried again, this time mentioning the name she had seen on the phone screen. Who was that person who called? Love. I saw it was a number I didn't know. Daniel, who was focused on a document, looked up, but didn't meet her gaze. Called. Oh, yes, that was a new client, a last-minute problem. Nothing much. His words were a tangle of haste and superficiality, a transparent veil that Clara felt she could tear through at any moment. He apologized, said he needed to resolve something urgent, and lock himself in the office, leaving Clara alone in the living room, with the echo of her own doubts. It was as if he were building invisible walls between them, brick by brick, and Clara was on the outside, watching. Clara's insistence, fueled by anxiety, didn't give up. One night, when the house was silent and the lights were low, she felt an urgent need for clarity. Daniel, she began, her voice low, almost a whisper. I feel like something is wrong. You're different. Is there something you're not telling me? He was reading a book, and the turning of the page stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was dense, filled only by the pounding of Clara's heart. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes, usually so full of tenderness for her, were clouded by a sudden irritation she had never witnessed. Clara, please. Don't start this. Nothing is wrong. I'm just tired. My head is full of work. Don't you trust me? His voice wasn't loud, but the harshness in his words, the tense expression on his face, hit Clara like a cold blow. It was a facet of Daniel she didn't know, a stranger in her own home. At that moment, something broke inside her. The initial surprise gave way to deep pain, an overwhelming sense of isolation. The man she loved, her safe harbor, seemed to have turned his back on her, hiding behind a wall of impatience and accusation. Trust, once an unshakable rock, began to crumble. Clara retreated, not just physically, but emotionally. Daniel's words, "Don't you trust me?" echoed, transforming into a trap. If she said no, she would be risking everything. If she said yes, she would be lying to herself. Paranoia began to set in, a deep-rooted weed. Every one of Daniel's absences, every missed call on his phone that she didn't dare ask about, every evasive glance, was another grain of sand on the scale of mistrust. She began to observe, secretly, Daniel's schedule, the rushed excuses to leave, the time he spent on his cell phone, which was once a tool of connection, now seeming like a portal to a secret world she couldn't access. The house, once a sanctuary of love and complicity, turned into a stage for silent observation, where Clara felt like a reluctant detective, searching for clues in crumbs of attention and restrained gestures. The emotional abyss between them widened, deep and silent. Their hands no longer sought each other out with the same spontaneity. Their gazes, once mirrors of their souls, now diverted, laden with unformed questions and unprovided answers. Conversations became superficial, focused on trivialities, avoiding the dangerous territory of emotions. Clara felt trapped in a cycle of uncertainties, each new day bringing with it the anguish of discovery or the torture of prolonged ignorance. The love they had built, the one that was her safest refuge, now felt like a prison of uncertainties and silences, its walls closing in around her, suffocating hope with every breath. The melody of their lives, once harmonious, had turned into a solitary lament, and Clara was the only one to hear it. The melody that once cradled her life, once harmonious and full of promises, had turned into a solitary lament, a silent requiem that Clara was the only one to hear. With each passing day, the invisible wall between her and Daniel grew thicker, impenetrable, made of eloquent silences and averted glances. Daniel's flimsy excuses, the eyes that darted away from hers, the veiled irritation that arose without warning. All of this accumulated in her soul, weighing like cold, damp stones. She felt herself drowning in a sea of uncertainties, and with every desperate stroke, the exhaustion became deeper, more paralyzing. The mirror, unforgiving, reflected a woman she barely recognized, deep-set eyes, a ghostly pallor that seemed to carry the crushing weight of a world on the brink of collapse, and the shadow of a long-forgotten smile, replaced by a thin, tense line on her lips. Loneliness, once an abstract concept, was now a cold, sharp, visceral reality. There was no longer refuge within the walls she once called home, nor comfort in the arms that were once a safe harbor. It was as if the person she loved had been replaced by a ghost, an absent but deeply disturbing presence that tormented her day and night. Paranoia, once a tiny seed of doubt, was now a leafy, dark tree, with twisted roots that dug deep into her mind and gnarled branches that stretched out, suffocating any remnant of peace or sanity. It was then that the image of Laura flashed into her mind like a beacon in the storm. Laura, the longtime friend, the confidant who had shared so many secrets and laughs, the most intimate joys and sorrows. The only person Clara felt she could still trust, the last hope before surrendering completely to the abyss of despair. With trembling hands, barely able to hold the cell phone, she dialed the number, her breath caught in her throat, every beat of her heart echoing in her ears. Her voice choked, she could barely form the words, but Laura, on the other end of the line, sensed the urgency, the raw, silent pain that radiated from every husky syllable. They met at a discreet cafe, an improvised refuge away from curious eyes, where the walls seemed to have the power to absorb the anguish that poured out. Clara sat at the table, the coffee untouched in front of her, the steaming cup ignored while her eyes, glassy and pleading, fixed on Laura. A silent plea for help was etched across every feature of her exhausted face. The words began to pour out, disjointed, tumbling over each other like a river overflowing after a violent storm. She talked about Daniel, about the abrupt change, about the icy abyss that had opened, relentlessly, between them. She talked about the suffocating feeling of being deceived, about the empty excuses that sounded increasingly like lies, about Daniel's sudden irritation that frightened her more than any open fight. Laura listened in absolute silence, her brow furrowed in deep concern, her astute eyes fixed on Clara's, absorbing every detail of her desolation. She saw the lacerating pain, the exhaustion that weighed on her friend's shoulders, the fear that danced in the depths of her eyes. She watched Clara unraveling before her, and her heart clenched with silent agony. When Clara finally stopped, breathless, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the table. Only the ambient noise of the cafe filled the void, but for Clara, it was the amplified sound of her own soul shattering into 1,000 pieces. Then Laura, in a soft voice, almost a whisper that barely broke the stillness, began to speak. "Clara, I know this is hard to hear, but Daniel has always been a little reserved, you know, ever since I've known him." The sentence hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning, a subtext that resonated in Clara's bones. She felt an icy chill run down her spine. He has a complicated past. It's not something he likes to share, or even revisit. It's always been like that, a book with a few pages torn out. There were no direct accusations, no explosive revelations, just a subtle, almost imperceptible validation of Clara's deepest fears. Her friend didn't say, "Daniel is cheating on you," or "Daniel has a horrible secret." She merely confirmed that Daniel always possessed a layer of mystery, a dark and inaccessible area that he guarded jealously. It was the clue Clara didn't know she was looking for, the piece that, when fitted, gave a terrifying shape to the puzzle of her paranoia. The seed of mistrust, previously nourished only by her own anxieties and feverish imagination, now received a bit of light and water from an external, unsuspecting source. Laura's words brought no comfort. On the contrary, they unleashed a new and overwhelming wave of terror. It was no longer the tormenting doubt of "Am I imagining things?" Now it was the cold, sharp certainty. I am not imagining things. There is something real and concrete to this. The air around Clara seemed to thin, making breathing a painful effort. Her world, already in ruins, now collapsed with alarming, dizzying speed. The reservation, the complicated past, all of this translated into a single, terrifying truth for Clara. Daniel was hiding something, and that something was big enough to mercilessly destroy everything they had built with such care. Clara's eyes filled with tears she tried in vain to hold back, but they streamed down, hot and plentiful, burning her face. It was a different kind of pain, a pain that came from the confirmation of her worst nightmares. There was no relief in the veiled truth, only the certainty that the darkness surrounding her was real, tangible, and now validated. Laura reached across the table, touching Clara's hand with a gesture of affection and concern, but Clara barely registered the touch. Laura's voice continued, but her words became a distant, indistinct buzz. Clara's mind was trapped in images of Daniel's past, a past she never truly knew, a past that now seemed like a locked door, guarding secrets that could completely unravel him or destroy her in the process. The irony was cruel, almost sadistic. She sought solace and found a veiled truth that only plunged her deeper into the abyss of uncertainty and fear. Her friend's warning cry didn't light a path at the end of the tunnel. Instead, it deepened the shadows, making them denser, more crushing, more terrifying. Clara felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. The conversation with her friend, which should have brought some relief, only solidified the fog of mistrust surrounding her, transforming it into an oppressive darkness. The words about Daniel's complicated past echoed in her mind like a funeral bell, poisonous seeds germinating in her chest, suffocating any remaining peace. She could no longer live in ignorance, imprisoned in the gilded cage of a happiness that now seemed a cruel farce. The need to know, however painful the truth, was now an uncontrollable force, a primal impulse pushing her toward the abyss. She started subtly, almost ashamed, feeling like an intruder in her own life, a spy in her own home. At first, it was a closer look at the bank statements that arrive home, previously just quick glimpses of numbers that seemed to mean nothing beyond routine. Now, every line, every transaction, was a potential code to be deciphered, a fragment of a map to an unknown and dangerous territory. Her eyes, once full of love and trust for Daniel, now scoured the cold ink of the paper with a feverish intensity, searching for patterns, for anomalies, for any break in the perfect surface of their life. Small expenditures in places she had never heard of began to emerge, like weeds in a well-kept garden. A florist in a distant neighborhood, a gourmet coffee shop Daniel had never mentioned frequenting, a lunch on a day when he should have been in a crucial meeting at the office. In isolation, they were insignificant, perhaps just forgetfulness or flimsy excuses she might have accepted without question. Together, however, they began to weave a web of inconsistencies, an icy whisper snaking through her mind. Something is wrong. Clara's throat tightened, and a cold knot formed in her stomach with every new discovery. Daniel's laptop, once a portal to his work, became an object of fascination and terror, a digital Pandora's box waiting to be opened. She waited for moments when he wasn't around, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum, blood pulsing in her temples. With trembling hands that seemed not to belong to her, she navigated folders, obscure browsing histories, archived emails. Every click was a stab in her own soul, a violation of a trust she feared no longer existed, a betrayal of herself. She felt the shame of what she was doing, but the desperation was greater, a monster that pushed her forward, whispering, "You need to know." Daniel's work hours, once so regular and predictable, were now questioned, dissected under the magnifying glass of her growing paranoia. She started watching the clock, timing his returns with almost obsessive precision, noticing small variations in his habits that would have previously gone unnoticed. A work call that stretched too long in the car parked in the garage, an unexpected delay due to non-existent traffic, the insistence on keeping the phone with him, even inside the house, away from her eyes. Every detail, previously dismissed as part of the routine, now fit together like pieces of a macabre puzzle, forming an image she did not want to recognize. The house, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, transformed into an emotional minefield, where every step was uncertain and dangerous. Every object, every familiar corner, seemed to hide secrets, silent murmurs of a parallel life. The scent of Daniel's cologne, once so comforting in hers, now carried a subtle note of strangeness, mixed with something she couldn't identify, but which made her recoil. She found herself watching him as he slept beside her in bed, the pale moonlight filtering through the window, trying to decipher the face she once loved so deeply, searching for any sign of guilt or deceit in the relaxed lines of his expression, but finding only an enigmatic void. The search for truth was a constant pain, a burden she carried alone, a corrosive secret. Nights were filled with insomnia, her mind racing in endless circles, constructing scenarios, replaying conversations, analyzing every gesture, every word from Daniel in recent months, transforming them into silent accusations. She was becoming a shadow of herself, consumed by paranoia, by anguish, by the sick need to unravel the mystery. The reflection in the mirror showed a woman with deep dark circles, injected and watery eyes, the sparkle of life replaced by a frightening, almost ghostly emptiness. She wasn't just looking for evidence, she was losing herself in the process, unraveling not only Daniel's secrets but also her own sanity, piece by piece. The fear of the truth was a terrifying abyss. But the fear of continuing to live in the lie, in suffocating uncertainty, was even greater. She continued to dig, deeper, more desperately, in search of a clarity that could finally free her, or destroy her completely. The first fissure in reality. Clara's search was a dive into a self-imposed abyss, every click, every paper turned, a step deeper into the darkness. The apartment, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, had turned into a silent stage for her private inquisition. Hours flowed like sand through her fingers, mixing with physical exhaustion and the anguish rooted in her chest. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now carried the weight of sleepless nights and a truth that, she felt, was about to reveal itself. She was no longer looking for a simple explanation. She was hunting for the crack, the seismic fault that would explain the tremor in her world. Daniel's machine, his work computer, lay on the office desk, a cold black monolith, guarding secrets. Clara hesitated. Invading that space was crossing an invisible line, a threshold of trust that, once crossed, would be irreversible. But the need to know was a fire consuming her hesitation. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the keyboard, but her determination was a shield against guilt. She needed to see, to touch, to understand what lay behind that gaze that, suddenly, seemed so unfamiliar. She navigated through folders named with the coldness of the corporate universe, projects, reports, contratus. Nothing. Just the impeccable routine of a dedicated professional. Clara's heart beat at an uneven rhythm, a mix of momentary relief and the oppressive certainty that the truth wouldn't hide in plain sight. She delved deeper, exploring hidden files, the digital corners where personal life often intertwines with the professional. It was an intimate, almost profane act of unraveling the soul of the one she thought she knew so well. And then, there it was. In an old documents folder, nestled among spreadsheets and forgotten presentations, a subfolder titled Memories appeared. The name, so out of place in the work context, made the air thin in Clara's lungs. With a slow, deliberate click, she opened it. Photos. Hundreds of them. They weren't family photos, of the trips they took together, of birthdays, of Christmases. They were other lives, other faces. Her blood ran cold. One image in particular jumped from the screen, capturing her gaze and freezing time. It was Daniel. Younger, perhaps 10 years earlier, with slightly longer hair and a smile she didn't recognize, freer, more relaxed than the one he had been displaying lately. He was in a park, under the bright sun of a summer day, holding the hand of a small girl, no more than 5 years old. The child had golden curls and large, curious eyes, a smile identical to Daniel's. They were both laughing, looking at something outside the frame, radiating a happiness so pure, so incontestable, that it stabbed Clara in the chest. The setting wasn't familiar. The trees, the architecture in the background, everything screamed another place, another life. The computer screen became a portal to a nightmare. Clara felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That wasn't a distant cousin, nor a friend's daughter. The resemblance was undeniable, the intimacy of the touch, the complicity of the smile. That girl was the spitting image of Daniel. Her mind spun, trying to fit the image into her reality, but there was no room. Her life with Daniel began 7 years ago. That child would have been, at minimum, 5 years old in that photo. The math was cruel, relentless. A silent scream was caught in her throat, a tight knot of horror and disbelief. The air felt heavy, dense, hard to breathe. Clara's hands trembled so much that she had to hold the desk to keep from falling. The image of Daniel with the unknown girl, so happy, so complete, was like a black hole swallowing all the light from her world. It wasn't the complete truth, she knew, but it was the first fissure, the first seismic crack that revealed the fragility of everything she believed. The reality she had built brick by brick with Daniel was collapsing into ruins around her, leaving her standing on the debris, alone, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. That smile in the photo, the one she had never seen, was proof of a secret life, of a love that was not hers, of a betrayal that now seemed to have deep and painful roots. Clara felt her hands tremble so much that the piece of paper, aged and yellowed by time, with a strange name and distant address, seemed to want to escape her fingers. The evidence, so cold and palpable, burned against her skin like an ember, a chilling flame that consumed her peace. Her heart, once a drum of muffled and misunderstood pain, now beat a frantic rhythm of fury and desperation, echoing in the silent walls of her house. She waited for him in the living room, in the warm twilight gloom of the late afternoon, a heavy, oppressive silence filling every corner of the space that once resonated with laughter, promises, and the sweetness of a love she believed to be unbreakable. Every minute was torture, Every shadow on the wall seemed to conspire against the idyllic image of life she had built. When Daniel finally crossed the threshold, the key turning with the familiar sound that once brought relief and comfort, the smell of his cologne and the sight of his tired but warm smile were a punch to Clara's gut. The mask he wore for the life they shared, for the happiness she thought was real, seemed thicker, crueler now. He saw her, standing there, rigid, her eyes fixed on his, and his smile wavered, the light in his eyes dimming like a candle in a strong draught. The air in the room thickened, laden with an almost electric tension, a premonition of a storm. "Clara, what happened? You look pale." His voice was soft, worried, the same voice that soothed her at night, that promised a future by her side. It was the voice of a consummate liar, and the realization brought a lump to her throat, an overwhelming urge to scream until her soul tore. She didn't answer immediately. Time seemed to stop. She simply held out her hand, revealing the object that unveiled the deception. Words were unnecessary. The faded photograph of a child smiling next to a younger Daniel, in a completely unfamiliar setting, spoke for itself. Or perhaps it was a legal document, a record of something he never mentioned. Daniel's eyes fixed on it, and she saw the color drain from his face. First, a chilling shock that petrified his features. The blood seemed to drain from him, leaving him pale, almost ghostly, as if he had seen a phantom. His lips moved, but no sound came out, just a muffled gasp. He was trapped, caught in the act, and the terror in his eyes was the most brutal confirmation Clara could have received. Then came the denial. Furious, desperate, almost childish in his attempt to defend himself. "What is this, Clara? Where did you get this? This means nothing asterisk. You are jumping to conclusions about something without context." His voice rose in pitch, a roar of forced indignation, trying to suffocate the truth that already hung in the air, thick as smoke. He tried to grab the object from her hand, but Clara recoiled abruptly, holding onto it as if it were the last piece of her own sanity, the only proof that she wasn't going crazy. "Don't you lie to me, Daniel." Her voice was choked with emotion, but carried a newfound firmness, cutting through his fury like a sharp blade. Tears welled up in her eyes, burning, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of him, not while he tried to diminish her pain, the magnitude of his betrayal. His moment of fury broke, giving way like a dam about to burst. The wall of lies cracked under the crushing weight of undeniable truth. His shoulders slumped, and the defensive glare in his eyes turned into something closer to despair and shame. He took a deep breath, a harsh, painful sound that reverberated in the stillness of the room, and then the confession began, slow, hesitant, but calculated in every word. I'm so sorry, Clara. I did something stupid. A mistake. A long time ago." He moved closer to her, his eyes welling up with tears, false or genuine. She couldn't tell, reaching out to touch her, but she abruptly pulled away, as if his touch might contaminate her. It was a moment of weakness. Something that stayed in the past, I swear. A bad phase of my life before you. It means nothing now. You are the only one for me. Always have been. My life started when I met you. The words were a poisoned balm, every syllable a dart covered in honey and betrayal. He pleaded, his voice hoarse and choked, his eyes fixed on hers, seeking a sliver of pity, of understanding. He flooded her with empty promises, a torrent of vows of eternal love, that he would never hurt her again, that she was the air he breathed, the center of his universe. But what he said was only one part, a carefully edited version of reality, stitched together to minimize his guilt and maximize her compassion. He refused to reveal the totality of the truth, the depth of the fissure, the true extent of his double life. There were gaps, eloquent silences between the words, like black holes sucking away the rest of the story, swallowing the truth whole. Clara was devastated. Her body shook uncontrollably, a tremor that came from within, and the ground seemed to fall away beneath her feet. The world she knew, the life she had built with Daniel, all disintegrated into ashes around her, carried away by a gale of lies. The pain was physical, a sharp pang in her chest that radiated throughout her body, leaving her breathless. The betrayal was real, the lie was colossal, and the feeling of having been a fool consumed her. But amidst the turmoil of pain and confusion, an inner voice, weak at first but increasingly insistent, screamed in her mind, piercing the fog of emotions. It's not everything. There is more. He is hiding much more. Daniel's partial confession did not relieve her. It only deepened the abyss of mistrust. The promises, once so sweet and comforting, now sounded hollow, calculated, and manipulative. She could sense the manipulation in every touch he attempted, in every word of forced repentance, an invisible web he was trying to weave around her to trap her again in his illusion. Fear mingled with rage and sadness, creating a bitter cocktail of emotions. Fear of what else he might be hiding, rage at having been deceived for so long, for having lived a farce, sadness over the irreparable loss of her innocence and their future together. That wasn't the Daniel she loved. Or perhaps, that asterisk was asterisk the real Daniel, and she had never truly known him. The uncertainty was a heavy burden, a darkness that spread, consuming any remaining hope that it was all just a misunderstanding. She looked at him, no longer with blind love, but with a chilling mixture of disillusionment and a newly awakened determination. The battle had barely begun, and Clara felt that, to survive, she would have to fight for every piece of the truth. The silence of the house was a mute scream, echoing the devastation Daniel had left in his wake. Clara dragged herself through the rooms, each step heavy as if carrying the weight of the world. Her eyes, once bright, now exhibited a painful opacity, the reflection of a soul in tatters. Daniel's partial confession, that mix of forced remorse and flimsy excuses, hammered in her mind like constant torture. He had tried to dilute the truth, wrap it in empty promises, but for Clara, that was just another layer of deceit. She felt, with the cold certainty of someone who had already been betrayed, that the scratched surface barely revealed the tip of a gigantic iceberg of lies. The pain was an ocean, but at the bottom of that abyss, a stubborn flame began to flicker. It wasn't the flame of vengeance, but the desperation for clarity, the visceral need to understand the depth of the betrayal that had shattered her. How to live, how to breathe again, if the truth continued to be a distorted shadow. Ignorance, she realized, was not a blessing. It was a prison with invisible walls, slowly suffocating her. To free herself, she would have to dive deep, however dark and menacing the unknown might be. The following days were a blur of insomnia and anguish. Clara watched the phone, feeling the urge to call Daniel, to demand more, to beg for answers. But the voice of reason, the one that had survived the explosion of her world, whispered that it would be useless. He had already shown his cards, and the truth he was willing to give was a convenient, masked truth. If she wanted the totality, she would have to hunt for it alone. The idea of investigating terrified her. The prospect of unearthing more lies, of deepening the wound, was almost unbearable. But the thought of living forever with doubt, with the gaps, was even worse. This was the turning point. The pain, which once paralyzed her, now became an implacable engine. She needed answers not to punish him, but to heal herself. To rebuild herself from the ruins, she needed to know the exact shape of the destruction. With trembling hands, but growing determination in her eyes, Clara began her own search. The computer, once a portal to leisure and work, transformed into an investigative tool. She reviewed old conversations, emails, photos. Small details, once insignificant, now gained a new and sinister outline. A random comment from Daniel about a business trip, a vague excuse for a delay, a sudden change of plans. Each fragment was a pin stuck in her memory, igniting an alarm. Her online research was a dive into a digital labyrinth. Names of hotels, cities casually mentioned, social media profiles she had never before noticed. She felt her heart race with every click, every new page loading. It was a nauseating mixture of fear and excitement, as if she were opening Pandora's box. Nothing explicit yet, just faint traces, loose threads that, when joined, began to form a subtle and disturbing web. A name, which Daniel had mentioned in passing once, began to appear in comments on public profiles, in discreet likes. With every minuscule discovery, the air became thinner in her lungs. Her mouth went dry, a metallic taste of bitterness settled in. But she didn't stop. Pain was a strange fuel, propelling her forward, even when her body begged her to give up, to close her eyes and pretend none of it existed. She couldn't anymore. The truth, however cruel, was the only compass in her darkness. In a moment of exhaustion, her eyes burning and her mind weary, the idea of hiring a private investigator seemed the only way out. The shame of exposing her pain to a stranger was immense, the cost a concern. But the loneliness of that search was overwhelming. She needed someone who could see what she couldn't, who could go where she didn't dare. It was an act of desperation, but also of courage. A last resort to unveil the mask Daniel had so masterfully woven. As she searched for agencies, the image of Daniel, his face contorted in a false plea, reappeared. That man she loved, that she believed she knew, was a stranger. And she, Clara, was now alone, navigating a sea of disappointment, driven only by the bitter promise that the truth, however lacerating, would be her only path to freedom. She felt she was about to open a portal to something much bigger, much darker than she could imagine, and there was no turning back. The devastating revelation. Clara felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. The diluted version of the truth Daniel had offered her was an insult, an open wound that pulsed with the urgent need to be exposed. She needed more, not for revenge, but to unearth reality, however grotesque, and thus, perhaps, find a way back to herself. The last sentence, like a dark echo, resonated in her mind. It was a portal to something much bigger, much darker than she could imagine, and there was no turning back. And she didn't want to. In the days that followed, Clara plunged into an abyss of screens and documents, her eyes reddened by fatigue and pain. Her skills, once used to build bridges and dreams, were redirected to dismantling a farce. She started with the fragments Daniel had dropped, a distant hotel name, a slightly altered flight date, a secondary email account he used for business. Every click was a step in the dark, every search a racing heartbeat in her chest that seemed ready to explode. Hiring a private investigator was an act of calculated desperation. He was a quiet man, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, and who promised absolute discretion. Clara handed him the few clues she had, the faintest hope mixed with the certainty that something was terribly wrong. Weeks dragged on, each day a silent torture. The detective sent short, dry reports, but every word was like a hammer, striking the wall of her denial. Secondary address confirmed in another city, one read. Regular trips to location X over the past few years, another pointed out. They were loose pieces, fragments that didn't make complete sense but formed a disturbing pattern. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. The detective, uncharacteristically, asked to see her in person. The coffee Clara offered him remained untouched. He placed a simple folder on the table, his eyes fixed on hers, as if preparing her for a blow. Mrs. Clara, he began, his voice grave, there's something more. Inside the folder, a photograph. It wasn't Daniel with another woman at a romantic dinner, or in a bar. It was an image of Daniel, smiling, next to a beautiful woman, and two children, a boy and a girl, radiant. They were in a park, under a sun that seemed to mock the darkness that enveloped Clara at that moment. The thin air of the apartment seemed to condense, heavy and cold. Clara felt a ringing in her ears, the world spinning. Her gaze, fixed on the photograph, trembled. The woman in the picture wasn't an affair, a fleeting fling. There was an intimacy, a familiarity that screamed family. The children, small mirrors of Daniel, were irrefutable proof of a life he had led in complete secrecy. The folder contained more. Birth certificates, school documents, vacation photos, clippings from a local newspaper with Daniel's name in community events, all in a town hundreds of miles away. Daniel didn't just have a mistress, he had a wife. He had children. He had a complete family, a parallel life meticulously constructed and maintained, while with Clara, he wove a tapestry of lies and illusions. The pain she felt before was merely a superficial scratch. This was a laceration, a dismemberment of her soul. The man Clara loved, the Daniel she thought she knew, the partner of so many years, the confidant of her dreams and fears, never existed. He was a projection, a facade, a masterpiece of deception. Every affection, every word of love, every plan for the future, all crumbled to dust, revealing the rottenness of a colossal sham. The image of Daniel in her mind was transfigured, from cheating lover to two-faced monster, an artisan of pain and manipulation. Clara closed the folder, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. The silence of the apartment was deafening, filled only by the sound of her own heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She didn't feel rage, not yet. What she felt was a terrifying emptiness, the complete annihilation of her reality. It was as if the world had been turned upside down, and she was falling, endlessly, into an abyss of disappointment. The truth, cold and cruel, had finally revealed itself in its totality. And it was far, far worse than any nightmare she could have imagined. The man she loved was a ghost, a shadow, and she was now, irremediably, alone in the darkness of her truth. The truth, once a distant whisper, was now a deafening scream, a primal roar that refused to be contained, echoing through the empty corridors of Clara's soul. The air became thick, almost palpable, heavy with the dust of her shattered dreams. Every breath was an excruciating effort, as if the oxygen were poison, burning her nostrils and tearing something deep in her chest. She didn't feel the floor beneath her feet. The world spun, not in a blur, but in sharp shards, each fragment a distorted image of her former reality, piercing her perception. Daniel. The name, once synonymous with security, home, unconditional love, was now a forbidden word, a venom that not only burned her tongue but incinerated her mind, reducing it to ashes. The image of another family, a wife, children, a parallel life in another city, danced in her vision, a cruel projection that overlaid all her happy memories with him. It was as if a horror film was being rebobbed in her mind, where every romantic scene was now tinged with a sinister red. Every shared laugh, every tender touch, every promise whispered beneath the moonlight, all turned into a grotesque farce, a puppet show where she was the manipulated doll. He, the man she loved, was an impeccable actor in a macabre play, and she, the naive protagonist, had been led onto the stage of her own destruction without even noticing the strings that controlled her. The initial shock gave way to a chilling numbness, a dulling that spread from her limbs to the core of her being, paralyzing her. She was there, somewhere, sitting or standing, it didn't matter, but at the same time, she was nowhere. Her body felt like an empty shell, heavy and inert, incapable of reacting to the catastrophe that had just imploded her reality. Tears? They didn't come. The well of pain was so vast, so abyssal, that the very capacity to cry had been sucked out, swallowed by the darkness. It was a void. A colossal void, which not only consumed but sucked out the very light, color, sound, the pulse of her existence, leaving only a distant echo of who she had been. She tried to take a deep breath, again and again, but the oxygen seemed not to reach her lungs, as if the air were thin, stolen by this new and brutal truth. An excruciating pressure settled in her chest, as if an immense weight were crushing her heart, slowly turning it to dust. Her mind, once so agile and full of plans for a future together, was now a chaotic battlefield, an incessant whirlpool of formless thoughts. Fragments of memories danced like ironic ghosts, each with a distorted smile. The day they met in the rain, the first time he said "I love you" with a conviction that now seemed diabolical, the choice of the engagement ring resting in her drawer, a symbol of a lie. Each of those moments, once precious, were now daggers, plunged deep into her flesh, twisting with every recollection. Rage began to bubble up, slow, hot, and suffocating, rising from her stomach to her throat, choking her. A rage that was not only at Daniel, the traitor, the liar, but at herself. How could she have been so blind? So naive? The clues, perhaps, were there, disguised, minimized, ignored by the thick fog of the love she believed she felt. The manipulation, so subtle and perverse, had become rooted in her life, transforming her perception of reality into a carefully constructed illusion, a house of cards that collapsed without warning. She hadn't just lost a love, she had lost herself in the sticky web of his lies, giving her trust, her soul, her essence to a phantom. Sadness was an overwhelming wave that came and went, dragging her to the bottom of an endless ocean of despair. It wasn't ordinary sadness, but grief. Grief for the life she thought she would have, for the family she dreamed of building, for the person she believed Daniel to be, a good, loyal man, her safe harbor. All of this was dead, buried under mountains of deceit, sealed forever. The feeling of betrayal was so profound that it seemed to have ripped her soul in two, leaving an open, bleeding wound that would never completely heal. It was as if the most vital part of her had been torn out, without anesthesia, leaving a pulsating, painful void. She saw herself in an abyss, a dark precipice where there were no echoes, only the deafening silence of her own desolation. The future, once a bright and promising horizon, painted with the vibrant colors of their dreams, now was an impenetrable wall of darkness, without cracks, without exit. What to do? Where to go? How to rebuild something from ruins so pulverized that they were once the castle of her dreams and hopes? The question hung in the heavy air, unanswered, floating like a ghost in the fog of her pain. Every fiber of her being cried out for a plan, for a direction, for a glimpse of light, but her mind was paralyzed, caught in the sticky web of pain and disbelief, unable to formulate a single coherent thought. It was an internal battlefield, yes, but not a field with clear weapons and strategies, nor visible enemies. It was a minefield of conflicting emotions, where every step, every memory, could detonate a new wave of pain, of despair, of anger. The enemy was no longer external. It was the very ghost of Daniel, the memory of a love that never truly existed, and the terrible realization that she had surrendered completely to a mirage, to a cruel illusion. She was there, In the center of her own perfect storm, alone, her heart shattered into a million pieces, and her soul crying out for a relief that seemed impossible to reach. The truth, cold and sharp as a diamond, had left her in pieces, a phantom in her own life, lost in the insurmountable darkness of her devastating truth. The empty echo of the devastating truth resonated in the corridors of Clara's soul, a ghostly sound that haunted her day and night. She was a spectre, moving through the ruins of her own life, the memories of a love that never existed burning like cold embers in her chest. For days, she floated, suspended between pain and disbelief, the ground beneath her feet pulverized to dust. Every breath was an effort, every thought, a stab. The image of the man she loved, now disfigured by the lie, was a grotesque shadow dancing in the corners of her vision. But amidst the insurmountable darkness, a faint thread of reason began to weave itself, thin as silk, yet surprisingly resilient. It wasn't burning rage, nor paralyzing sadness. It was something more primitive, more essential, the need to survive. Each morning, seeing her reflection in tear-filled eyes, she saw not only the victim but the exhausted warrior, wounded, but not completely broken. The farce had dismantled her life, yes, but it had also exposed the strength she didn't even know she possessed. A silent scream began to form within her, a cry for justice, for truth, for herself. The decision came not as a lightning bolt, but as the slow and inexorable rising of the tide. Sitting alone in the vast room that was once filled with false laughter and hollow promises, Clara understood that she could no longer be a ghost. She could not allow the lie to continue to dictate her existence. The only way to rebuild was to first demolish what remained of the illusion. The rotten roots had to be torn out so that something new could flourish. The first and most painful decision, a deep cut into her own flesh, was divorce. It was not just the end of a marriage, but the annihilation of a dream, of a future she had built with such care. Signing those papers would be like signing the death certificate of a part of herself, but it was an inevitable step. With a tight heart and trembling hands, Clara sought support, a beacon in the dense fog. Whispered conversations, compulsively reviewed documents, the cold blade of truth being sharpened with every new discovery. The farce was bigger, more complex, and crueler than she had ever imagined. It was not just a personal betrayal. It was a tangle of deceit that harmed other people, other lives. The rage, once contained, erupted into a cold, resolute flame. She couldn't just get divorced and disappear. She needed to expose the sham, to report him, to unmask the manipulator who had sown destruction in so many hearts. The prospect of exposing everything, of dragging the intimacy of her pain into public scrutiny, was terrifying. The fear of retaliation, of being ridiculed, of having her own sanity questioned, was almost overwhelming. But the alternative, living with the weight of that truth alone, allowing him to continue unpunished, was even worse. It was a prison without bars. Taking a deep breath, like a diver about to descend into the depths, Clara made her choice. She would move mountains, face storms. She would file the complaint, hand over the evidence, speak her truth, however painful it might be. It was an act of almost superhuman courage, born not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to act despite it. The following days were a blur of lawyers, meetings, testimonies. Every word uttered was a wound reopened, a piece of her soul exposed. She felt the judgment, the looks of pity, the morbid curiosity, but she stood firm. It was a battlefield, and she was fighting for her own life, for her dignity. The cost was high, sleepless nights, and knot in her stomach, the profound exhaustion that permeated every cell of her body. But with every small step, every document handed over, every truth spoken aloud, a tiny weight was lifted from her shoulders. Freedom, still distant, was beginning to feel reachable. Clara looked towards the horizon, no longer at the destroyed past, but at the uncertain future. The ruins of her life were still there, but she was no longer a prisoner of them. She was the architect of her own reconstruction. The truth, though liberating, had left deep scars, indelible marks on her heart and mind. But those scars were not symbols of weakness. They were silent witnesses to an extraordinary resilience, a strength she had found in the deepest adversity. The journey was long and painful, but amidst the desolation, a seed of hope was finally beginning to flourish, fragile but persistent, promising healing.